All right, we are live. Welcome back to another week of Marketwise Radio. I don't know about you, Delilah. It's been a pretty quiet couple weeks here, hasn't it?
It is. It
Very
has
quiet, uneventful.
nothing happening other than we keep getting potential hurricanes here in Florida.
Yeah, let's not talk about that. Let's just assume that's fake news.
Fake news? Really? Okay. Okay, well,
This is not a political show. It's not, and I'm kidding. Oh my God, it's been a weird few weeks, but you know
it
what? I'm glad the election's over. Everybody can
has.
go back to doing their thing. Hey,
Yes.
look, election's over. World hasn't blown up.
No, we're
Crazy.
still here. Thank God.
We're
Good.
still here. We're
Okay.
still here.
And we're still here and we're still in housing and appraisal and everything home ownership. So what have you been hearing after the election, Marcus?
Yeah. So this week, so part of what we're doing here with the podcast with MarketWise Radio is it's a piggyback, right? So I sit and I write every week or every 2 weeks as we're releasing these things on three things I'm looking at that I find to be interesting, things that are in the news, and I
Yep.
like to talk about them a little bit in depth. We got a couple of high priority topics that are coming up. The first one we're going to talk about is, first and foremost for our audience is the housing market and what's going on with rates and why things are behaving the way that they are. The second thing that we're going to touch on is like, I don't want to say economic skepticism, but maybe my economic skepticism of the reaction of the markets to the election. And I mean, I remember I woke up the next day and we got a 3% jump in the S&P. And 2 days after the election, that Thursday, which was the 8th,
Yeah.
Fed Chair Jay Powell dropped rates 25 basis points. And what happened to the housing market? What happened to 30-year rates? They went up, which is weird, right? So I'm going to talk about that a little bit.
Okay, cool.
And the last thing we're going to talk about, and again, this is not political, but this is just the economics of this idea of tariffs and their effect on the housing market. So I'm going to
Let
go down a little bit in depth and talk about, you know, what would that mean for home builders and what would that mean in a couple different ways. And I'm going to bring in some of my own thoughts on some of the proposed ideas of the kind of like a ways to alleviate what I'm looking at as kind of like a housing crisis. And
yeah.
then I got to remember this, but I was listening to a really interesting podcast with the venture capitalist Peter Thiel. He's an interesting dude, and I don't necessarily agree with all of his viewpoints, but I was listening to him on a podcast for like 2 hours today and talking about immigration and how it could affect the housing market. And
Yep.
we're going to cover all that.
Okay, well, let's get into it. We'll talk housing. Let's start off with days on the market. What are you seeing, Marcus? Like pending sales. What's going on with that?
Yeah, so for the last 10 weeks, they were growing, but I don't know if that's the case right now. I haven't looked at the data for this week, but something we talked about in the blog was that it was like a 10-week streak in pending sales growing, which is great. Housing activity picked up a little bit. Rates were not as high as they were. So the first thing that we're talking about in the blog this week is the housing market slowdown. I mean, there's seasonality that plays into it. Thanksgiving's coming up,
Yeah.
December, obviously we have the holidays and everybody's traveling, and there's a lot to be said for that. That happens every single year. But the unexpected part, which am still trying to figure out, and this is probably a better question for Logan Moshami over at Housing Wire because he's like
Oh,
the data
Logan
expert on
with
all this
the good,
stuff.
Logan with the good hair. Go ahead.
Dude, great hair. I did a podcast with him a couple of years ago. It was awesome. That guy just rattles off so much data. And
Yeah.
I can't hold a candle to that. I'm just like a normal person trying to figure out exactly what is going on in the bond market and housing market. But the thing that I just noticed, and I'm sure everybody did that's in our industry, was that a couple weeks ago we're looking at that Fed rate cut, right? So everybody's been waiting for the last 2 years
Yep.
for the Fed to cut rates. And we got 50 and then we got 25, but excuse me, the 10 year is back up. It was like 4.4 today. So mortgage rates are spiked. which I haven't checked the NBA application data, but it's kind of killing demand again. Uh, Again, I got to go back and look at the numbers. I don't want to speak out of turn, but I could say anecdotally, I think a lot of people are probably going to be putting a pause, or maybe they won't move as quickly to get to get a mortgage application or to put houses under contract. And you know, the other data point that we're talking about in that first section of the blog is that home prices are up 4% year over year.
Yeah, they
So
are.
there's the housing doom crowd, the guys that think that there's some giant housing bubble. There's a very tangible reality in the housing market that they're not thinking of. So, if you think the housing market's going to crash, we're going to go back to some 2000, 9, 10 style housing bubble, it doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. I agree wholeheartedly. They say I've been in the business for 23 years now. They say that October typically is a great month, if not the greatest month, to actually start looking if you are a buyer. Because why? You're going to get a better deal. The holidays is really not known for people to purchase a home and move and so on and so on. And because of that, you could potentially get a better deal. That's how it's been in the past. But this year, it was kind of, it came to like a halt almost.
Yeah.
And even I will say myself, I have a property that I would like to dump in the Chicagoland area. And I myself had to pause myself and really be like, okay, let me think, because I'm not going to get what I'm wanting to right now, not only with the rates, but just things are just at a pause. And it is one of those things where you just have to write it out, right? You just have to
Yeah.
write it out and hopefully it'll circle back. I know for a fact that housing bubble people claim to be on all these other social media platforms. I'm sorry, unless the good Lord comes back, it ain't happening. I don't see it. We
Yeah.
sometimes don't have a rate issue per se. We have an inventory issue, Marcus. You know that. We have an
Oh,
inventory,
yeah. Yeah.
not
I
enough
know.
inventory.
Yeah. And I'm going to touch on that later in the last
Uh-huh.
part. That's like the third story that I covered this week. But
Yeah.
there's only so many levers, and I think it's we can opine and try and be the crystal ball crowd all we want, but the data is what it is. The Fed doesn't have the bond market under control. The bond market, dollars are just pouring into U.S. bonds, and the bond auctions have spiked. So, like,
Yeah.
4.4 means that we're looking at a 30-year in the low sevens and high sixes.
Yep.
So if we're looking at limited inventory, and what we're seeing here, I'm noting, and look at my notes over here, but 4% year over year, right? So if a $500,000 house, I'm going to pull
Yeah.
out, look at this. So I love this. I bought this a couple years ago, and I was always, like, "Oh, I'm just going to use computers for everything."
Oh, well,
But there's something so satisfying about using this little guy.
of
So
course.
now if we're looking at let's just say a $500,000 house, right? A 4% increase year over year, that's $20,000. So now $520,000 house is 4% less affordable. So now if you amortize that over 30 years, I mean, think about the cost, the increase in the cost of home ownership, just in terms of interest rates, right?
Yep.
People's wages are not going up that quickly,
They're not. They're not.
right? So it's a dance that most people can't afford to get in on.
You're 100%. And that's even with the rates being, like you said, high sixes and low sevens, right? On an FHA, a 30-year fixed. Even if, listen, if you can get yourself in a property, get yourself in that property, because trust and believe that value of the property will go up. It is rare that it will go down. And you're basically waiting and hoping, but that value will go up. Get in there, sit on it, and then once the rates do come down, you refi.
Right.
That's what it is.
Right.
But get yourself in the property, because then what happens if you wait a year or two? Sorry, there's something in my eye. You're not going to be able to afford that property. So,
Right. I mean, so it's a very simple. There's if there's a Wizard of Oz behind the curtain of the housing market, right? They've only got a couple levers to play with. Individual incomes, right? There's number one. Those are increasing at a very nominal rate. I mean, it's
yep,
pretty fixed, whatever it is, 3% a year, 4% a year. um, the rate of inflation, right? So this is a really hot topic, and I'm going to interject my thoughts here as well. And this is somewhat of a political hot topic these days, but people keep talking about the pain of inflation. Man, it's not something that's going to, we're not entering a deflationary environment, right? So that means that the cost of goods, the whole goal of the Federal Reserve, everybody who understands housing economics, we keep talking about the Fed. The Fed has a dual mandate. They're there to keep prices under control and keep employment stable.
Yeah,
Employment's stable, and for the most part, prices are now under control. But when you look at CPI, when you look at their other gauges like PPE and core inflation, those are always positive numbers. Their goal is to keep them positive. Their goal for the last 2 years was to control the rate of acceleration. So it's like you had a runaway freight train, they had to slow it down. That's why they jacked up rates so quickly. But it's not like we're entering an environment where we're going for a recession. So when you hear politicians saying, "Yeah, we're going to get inflation under control and we're going to control the cost of goods," and I heard stuff during the presidential campaign where people were talking about price controls, and it's like, yeah, that's never going to work. You can't. You're not instituting price controls in this country. It's bad. It's bad economics. Doesn't make sense. But the flip side of the discussion is that they're focusing on this idea of controlling prices. And all you can hope for at this point is to control the rate of increase. Because if we get to a position where prices start to decrease, so let's say in some magical world, in Econ 101, you learned about this concept of the benevolent dictator, like the one person that could, let's say, magically pull the puppet strings of everything in the economy and direct things on their own 100% in some crazy godlike omniscient way.
yeah,
Now, if you were to do that and you were to somehow magically, like benevolent dictator, sign the decree, we're going to decrease prices, right? So we're going to be in what would be considered like a deflationary environment. Well, the Fed would look at that and they would say, we need to stimulate economic growth because prices are decreasing. And that's counterintuitive to their goal. The whole goal is price stability. They've controlled the runaway rate of inflation. And now, when it comes to, let's bring it back to housing, right? The goal is to stimulate growth in the housing market as far as we're talking, right? So, really, the only way to do that at this point is for mortgage rates to decrease. But the asset prices are not going to decrease. In my opinion, I don't think that they're going to be coming down anytime soon unless we get a huge glut of inventory. Or I think the other possibility, which I'm seeing locally down here in South Florida, even though there's still strong demand, is days on market go up so much, sellers have no choice but to drop the prices. And then you might see some sort of, categorical shift downward.
yeah, agreed. And it's the same here in Central Florida. You are starting to see the pending sales or the days on the market longer than
Right.
before. I mean, even here in Orlando, it's such a still attractive area, right? Because Central Florida is more affordable than where you're at in Florida. But
Yeah,
so
marginally.
I mean, the whole state of Florida is in demand. Let's just be honest. Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel we need a hey, no vacancy sign up on
Yeah, but
for the
we have
countryside because it is
it,
hard, but the demand is here. And yeah, I mean, you still have affordable housing. You can still find your little pockets outside of the Orlando area, but you're 100% right. I mean, it's just going to continue to go up. The demand is going to continue to go up. You have also a lot of it. I, I hate to say this, but like the generations, the populations really make that happen. Nobody ever, when they retire, they're like, I'm going to retire and move to like Montana. Nobody ever says that. What do they always go? They come to Florida or they come to Texas or they come maybe the Carolinas,
we'll
right?
get a bigger house.
Or get a bigger house or they downsize. But the
Yeah.
fact of the matter is you have the largest generation, which is the baby boomers, which was my mother, right? And they have the last wave entered retirement. So you have that huge, there's millions of them still alive. And where are they coming?
Get out. Get out. We're closed.
I mean, it is really getting really bad to the point where
I
again,
know.
it's affecting South Florida, Central Florida, Northern Florida, or whatever you the case may be. But I agree with you wholeheartedly, like the demand is still there. They talk about, like you said, these government dudes about inflation. It's just it
Here,
doesn't
here's my closing point on this
uh-huh.
topic of like housing uncertainty and inflation. If you guys believe, or if anybody believes that the same people that printed $14 trillion between Biden and Trump's terms in office
Uh-huh.
printed $14 trillion, you can go on the
Yep.
Federal Reserve's website
Right.
and look at the M2 money supply when it's like 40% increase in the last
Yep.
whatever 5 6 years, whatever that discrete period of time post COVID was. They're both to blame, right? So the politicians that are trying to legislate their way out of this, they're the ones that caused it. I don't think that they're necessary. And I'm not a big government person, so I'm firmly on the side that, the people creating the problem aren't the best people to fix it. But, I'm no genie here, and I'm not necessarily saying that I have the answer, but it's just like if we're looking at this objectively, there's only a few levers to pull.
Yeah.
So that being said, let's leave that, and we're going to touch on that again at the end because I want to talk about this second thing, which is interesting, which we're writing about this week on the blog, which is this unbelievable optimism that came up the day after the election. I said it to you before the show started, but I woke up the day after and Bitcoin's rallying into the
So,
80s, 90s. It's like in the
yep.
low 90s right
Why?
now.
Why is that, Marcus?
I mean, I could give you my take on it. I think that Bitcoin's looked at as this alternative store of value that is there's a finite and discrete supply of the digital asset, which can't be inflated or deflated. I mean, there's a fixed amount of it out there. Once it's printed, it's done. Minted, I should say. I don't want the crypto guys to come after me for that, but uh, I think there's some optimism around that, but I don't know if there's any like fundamentals that really speak to it should be X price target or not. I mean, maybe it speaks to scarcity and demand, and that's some
Yeah.
simple economics you could get into, but the market went nuts. The stock market went nuts.
Yes.
And at the same time, we're seeing people that are optimistic, but I don't know if I think the stock market's not a reflection of reality anyways, because I think the stock market's been completely detached from the fundamentals of what those companies are really worth for a couple of years now. And I think that there's some pretty, like I listened to a show last night from the Journal talking about Warren Buffett, and he's a pretty savvy investor, and he's got a record amount of cash on hand, just preparing for something, right? So there's some pretty smart people that have very mixed opinions on this. I don't know if that means that he's looking at some kind of pullback, which I think the market's well overdue for personally, but uh, I think there was a spike in optimism, and I don't know what your thoughts are on
I mean,
post-election change optimism.
I think the people spoke and that affected, that, and I'm not big on crypto. You know, I buy into a little bit. Yes, I do. But in all honesty, I can't explain it. All I know is that it just skyrocketed for whatever reason. And it's just one of those things where you can't explain it, right? It was not predicted. No one ever talked about it prior to the election. And then all of a sudden, boom. And I kind of, again, it's just my opinion. My feelings are not facts. Okay. But I think it was just to give the people a little bit of hope, a little bit of optimism, because for even still today, Marcus, I'm still good. I Even in the midst of all of this, thank God I'm still good. My business is good. I own several properties. Like, I'm not in the position as most Americans, and I will say that, right? But sometimes it's like they do certain things to kind of, I don't know, give hope. And
Yeah, it's like a populist cash
yeah,
grab.
yeah, it's
You
like
want
a
to
little
touch on that.
like an adrenaline, right? To be like,
Yeah.
"Look, you see, change happened, and look how fast this happened." That's my feeling and my take on it. So I know we can. we can jump further, but I mean,
Yeah, it's
we
just
so this
I
the
think it's a mirage. Honestly,
at this point, I
I
don't
don't
even
think that it I
yeah.
don't think it has much to do with like the underlying economics. I
Mm-mm.
think that I personally think it's a mirage when we're just talking stocks and crypto stuff like that skyrocketing, going up, the whole market's up over 3 points from
Yeah,
the last week. I mean, does that mean people are just more confident? Maybe.
maybe.
Maybe it's just like a little bubble coming up after the election. People believe the change is going to mean something positive, so things
Correct.
are
That's
perceived
what
to be worth
exactly what
more.
I'm getting at.
Yeah. But that again, that doesn't change the reality for everybody's individual lives. Now, anybody who's listening and you're working with borrowers or you're somehow operating within this housing market, that's great. That's super cool. Stocks are worth more, but crypto's worth more. But the reality is the individual is still looking at reference the last 10 minutes of this discussion. They're still looking at cost of living that's higher and
Yes,
not
it is.
deflating. It's
Nope.
continuing to go up as per the plan.
Wages are not.
Wages are not going up and home prices are still up. So that means that housing by and large is still less affordable than it was a year ago when
Right.
things were already unaffordable.
Yeah.
Now, if you go back and you look at the great big charts of housing prices and rates of GDP growth, I mean, we haven't hit a period of true pain in years. There was a very brief thing during COVID where unemployment spiked like crazy. But if you
Mhm.
go back and look at the big charts of
No,
like a serious asset price decline, hasn't happened in a long time. And I think that the government is now going to be faced with this very, to me, it's a confusing problem because I don't really know what the out is on it unless, and I'm going to touch on this thought next, which is there's too much money being pumped into the economy.
of
And
course.
that's because of the government's just overspending. So now if there's trillions of dollars being created every year and we don't have a balanced budget, well, all those dollars go somewhere. I mean, that might go to
They,
a defense
they,
contractor. Those dollars end up in the economy. Those end up in people's
they,
pockets. Those end
they,
up in
they do.
company coffers. And that's going to be a big point of contention. And let's see if President Trump and Congress can do something. There's this very interesting, it's just hilarious, Department of Governmental Efficiency. Trump just appointed Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to come in and to cut spending.
Hmm.
Now, my thought experiment on that was like, okay, so if the government's spending, let's just say $6 trillion a year or something, that's their full budget. They're running deficits to do that, of course, but let's say they chop 20% off that, or 2 trillion. Let's see, there was a comment made by Elon Musk at a rally saying, oh, we could cut $2 trillion potentially out of the budget. Where's that coming from? That is a very interesting question. And I don't know if that would immediately lead to economic activity slowing or GDP growth slowing or a whole host of other things.
It's, uh, it's just the question that you just don't know. I mean, and we can get into your last topic because I know we're almost 24 minutes, into it.
Yeah, I know. And again, this is not like I'm here to opine on politics, but I do like
No,
to opine
I-
on economics. And the government is directly responsible for a lot of these
absolutely.
questions because I think the government's this is bipartisan thing, but government spending completely distorts economic reality because they're like the guy with the dollar bill gun just constantly making it rain on the economy, goosing the thing up.
Yeah.
But the bill's got to get paid at some point. If you
Yeah.
go and look at the federal budget right now, the line item on interest is like some I don't know six. It's a what would that be? A 12-digit interest payment every year. 12 digits. So that's it's like 800 or 600 or I don't even remember. I have to go back and pull that up. But I mean, it's a huge number. Um, and anyways, let's not dig too deep on that, but it's something to think about. I mean, it's not such a straightforward discussion, and I don't think anybody should make it out to be some kind of easy answer because it's
I
not.
I agree. I agree. I mean, the government and politics, as much as you don't like it, they are so impactful to our industry. Point and simple.
Oh yeah, yeah. We'll see how that plays out. But then, so we're going to piggyback on the first topic, and we're going to touch on this now. So, a big discussion that everybody should be looking at, good, bad, ugly, all of it, is this idea that President Trump's he's going to potentially, part of their economic agenda coming into their term starting in January is going to be the implementation of potentially very broad-reaching tariffs. Now let's see how they actually implement it. But here's like the big thought experiment, right?
Okay.
What are we looking at? What you said it a few minutes ago, but I want you to answer it again. What's the biggest constraining factor in inventory issues right now?
If there's not enough,
Right.
there's just not enough
So
inventory.
there,
Yep.
there, there's two things to be mindful of when thinking about housing inventory issues and how politics and economics are going to impact that. So there's two things, and the first thing is going to be immigration. Now, if the administration is able to implement a broad, I don't know how to say it nicely, but the way that they're phrasing it is a broad deportation
A deportation
initiative,
of illegal immigrants. That's what's
right?
exactly that term, illegal immigrants. Yep.
So there's a couple things that I would start to think of then. Those same illegal immigrants are part of the labor input cost
Correct.
equation when it comes to new home construction.
That is correct.
Now,
Yep.
let's say that builders suddenly lose a portion of the workforce potentially, right? So let's just say I'm the benevolent dictator. I kick out whatever number of illegal immigrants there are, and let's say a non-insignificant portion, of those people are building homes, and maybe
Correct.
they're doing it illegally, but that might be the case right now, and that probably is the case right now. Now, if builders then have to pay market rates, there's a potential for those labor cost increases to be
So
passed on to the
really
consumer.
high, and that is definitely something in our industry that's known. And people, it's such a, it is
Forget
a,
the politics of it. This is a math equation.
it is.
There's a potential that that could increase the cost of a home, right? So now if it costs 15% more to build the home just due to labor costs,
That will
home
be
builders are,
to the lender or to the consumer or
yep,
built to the rate, however you want to call it, all of that. And it will
there's
be
a cost.
more.
There's hidden externalities to everything, and that's one of them. But on the flip side, and this is something I never really considered, I was listening to that Peter Thiel podcast I was talking to you about earlier, and they were discussing impacts of illegal immigration. Now, those same immigrants
Mhm.
could be having an outsized effect on demand for existing available rental inventory and housing
That
inventory.
is correct.
So there's also a potential that demand goes down. Now, this is all in the grand, you know,
Yeah,
we're putting on the not tinfoil hat, but we're putting on the benevolent dictator hat and looking at things, in a bubble. So that's possible too. There's like a negative and a positive implication to that. So a bunch of labor force is no longer available to work.
mm-mm.
Well, there's the possibility that prices go down in terms of demand on the market for housing, but there's also the potential that labor costs go up, right? Because now if everybody
It,
has to pay a higher rate, well, there's something to think about.
you're absolutely right. I agree with you. And it's one of those things we'll have to wait and see.
Right.
More critical for places, Florida's a red state, so it's a little harder here. Let's just be honest. Okay. But I own a couple of properties in Chicago. That is a big, that is a big, it's a what they call a sanctuary city. So the immigration population is extremely large there. There is where you'll have to see. right?
Yeah, so it's a wait and see. It's just like I'm talking about things I think about in my head. So this is the place for me
Yeah.
to get it off, and maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I mean, I could be completely off base on this,
No,
but I mean, I have a decent enough understanding of economics where, all right, there's only so many levers, so let's pull those levers in our head and see what the outcome could be.
you're 100% right. Well, let's wrap it up and take it home. Like anything else?
One more thing. So on that same
Mhm.
flow, we'll pull a couple minutes. You guys will have to
Yeah, of
stay
course.
attention tuned for 5 more minutes. But let's say that in that same thought experiment, tariffs are implemented, like a broad,
Mhm.
uh, far-reaching, whatever number of dollar tariff is. Those same home builders, let's say that large part of the labor force becomes more expensive. Now, at the same time, there's the potential that those tariffs could be implemented, and that could impact the cost of goods across the board. So, like, if you're a home builder and you're importing, they're importing goods, they're importing raw materials, they're inputting components to the homes, maybe insulation, maybe whatever construction materials,
Or
now if
yeah, anything.
20, let's say that those go up by a double digit percentage points, there's another thing that could impact the cost to consumer for a home,
Yeah.
right? Because now now you're paying more for all the materials, you're paying more for the labor, and then the cost once it hits the market is going to be higher. I don't know how much higher, but it's something to think about.
Yep.
These hidden externalities on our industry are there.
Right.
So we don't know what's going to shake out, but these are things I'm thinking about, things I'm writing about, and things that the housing market's just going to have to be very mindful of, and the politicians are going to have to sculpt policy around. There's this idea that Trump won on a mandate, right? The mandate largely reflected unhappiness with the economics of the country, which
Yep.
is high cost of goods, high cost of housing, and wage stagnation. So, as they make policy decisions, I'm not speaking out of line when I say this, but it's just they're going to have to address the needs of the everyday person because
The working person. Yes.
yeah,
One.
because they are the ones that are demanding to be listened to, and I think that it's a very fair position to put the politicians in, is to pay attention to what the everyday person needs, because there's only so much elasticity in how we can live our lives. So we don't know. We'll see. But we talk about that all. I know that we're running up here on the end, but I encourage everybody go read this week's edition of the blog. I'll send out the newsletter
Please
tomorrow or Monday.
do. Feel free to comment, ask questions. Marcus and I are always available,
Right.
and take us home. Yeah.
Yeah. So what we're looking out at now over the next 2 weeks, we're going to come back in 2 weeks to do another show, but the big thing coming up is, the market's going to still be slow through the end of the year. We're going to have to watch the bond market. We're going to be watching rates. We're going to be watching housing demand as a function of mortgage rates and see how these things shake out. But, it's kind of a wait and see thing for now. And I think we're in for an exciting couple months, to say the least.
I agree wholeheartedly. We'll see what we get into for, God willing, 2025. So,
Absolutely. Well, guys, thanks again for tuning in. This was the second edition. We're on episode number 2 of Marketwise Radio. Feel free to follow us on LinkedIn. Go check out the website, marketwisevaluation.com, where we have the blog and the MarketWise Bulletin, which again, I'm going to send out that email with a kind of recap of the blog and a link to the blog and to the radio show coming up here either tomorrow if I have time. Funny enough, I'm going to be at a housing affordability summit put on by the Florida Bankers Association. It's got a pretty rock star cast of people.
that's what
The mayor of Miami is going to be there speaking, so I'm going to go listen all day tomorrow.
yeah,
Get my
yeah.
finger on the pulse of this stuff, and I will be back in 2 weeks. We will touch base on what I learned, and thanks again for tuning in.
Yep. Make good choices, guys. Bye.
Good choice.